Okay, so we've all seen this, and everyone who's done teaching, everyone who's done any part of teaching has heard about Blooms, and Blooms is really, really good. Blooms is great. Blooms is brilliant. But what should we actually use Blooms for? Is the question I'm asking today. Lots of people think it's useful, and of course it is useful. But what actually do people use it for? Andy, what do you think? I mean, what have you seen in your experience? I know I've seen in my experience. Let's see. I mean, what have you seen?
Yeah, I think the first thing we need to kind of get out of the way here is that what we're not saying about Blooms. I don't think we're sort of saying that it's a bad thing at all. I think we're trying to say that it's a very, very useful tool.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think that the key here is that we're saying that we've seen all sorts of places where we've seen it used not really for what we think it's for. And over the years, I've seen it used really for trying to stem questions a lot of the time, and also for differentiation. And it isn't always used in the best way for a lot of those things. Like, for example, I've seen lots of teachers think to themselves, well, you know, we've got kind of low-level Bloom's questions where we have kind of things for recall, and high-level Bloom's things where we have kind of, you know, synthesis and analysis. And what a lot of teachers will do is they'll say, okay, we've got these lower-level kids, we'll just give them recall questions. We've got these higher-level kids, we'll give them synthesis analysis questions, and we'll just go for those kids with those sorts of questions. And that's my differentiation done, that's my questioning done, and they kind of just switch off at that point.
Yeah.
And you know, I think sometimes teachers use it as a bit of a crutch for a lot of the questioning, a lot of the differentiation, and that isn't great if they do that sort of thing.
No, I mean, I would agree. I would agree with you there, and I would absolutely agree that this idea of almost some is not correct. I don't believe teachers use almost some anymore, and I don't believe that it should be used. But actually, if you're using Blooms wrong, because Blooms is obviously very, very useful, but if you're using Blooms wrong, it almost kind of boils down to almost some, doesn't it? In using these trigger words, using these verbs.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, I've observed lots of lessons over my time, and you know, I've seen lots and lots of occurrences where we've seen this put up at the start of a lesson as, in some cases, it's actually been sort of pointed out as a really good form of differentiation, this kind of must, should, could model, where we've got kind of, you know, students being said, you know, you've all got to do this must item, you know, you could do this and you should do this. And obviously then picking out, you know, these different Bloom's words, you know, describe, explain, analyze for different levels of students.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of issues with this, I think, because you got describe, explain, analyze. Well, first off, do students always, if they read those without them being explained, understand necessarily what the difference is between these things? You know, if you're quite a low-level student who's not that cognitively able, would you immediately think to yourself, in this particular example I've got here, describe and explain the differences between, you know, the reasons the Second World War took place? Well, would they immediately think to themselves, oh, right, there's a big difference between describe and explain? They wouldn't necessarily do that, would they? I don't think.
No, I don't think they would. I know that in the past I have definitely taught students that do not understand the differences between these trigger words here. And is it our job, though, would you say? I mean, just playing devil's advocate, for us to teach those trigger words and make it kind of a diet of learning, but then do we not then actually, what are we teaching the content, or are we teaching these words?
No, absolutely. And I think a lot of the time when we're looking at these particular words, we're looking at something quite different, because this is more, I think, to do with exam practice, you know, because they're going to be asked in exams to do these things like describing and explaining. And I think at some point we've got to explain to them what these words mean, because they'll be asked in exam questions to do these things. But this is a separate skill, because I think when you're actually trying to differentiate a lesson, you've got to kind of think to yourself, well, if you've got this particular thing in front of you, you might have different reasons within this example. So, for example, you might have this reason the Second World War took place that's reasonably easy to understand, And you might have some other reasons that are more difficult to understand. So you might think to yourself, okay, well, I'll get my smarter kids to go away and look at the more difficult reasons, some of my weaker students to look at some of the easier reasons, and then maybe at some point later in the lesson, they can come back together and teach each other all the different reasons you've looked at, and then maybe at the end of the lesson, they can all write about all of the reasons, rather than having these just, I don't want to call it lazy, but this kind of idea that we just have these different trigger words and then you've automatically differentiated your lesson, rather than thinking through, well, what's actually more difficult in the lesson, and then have different things for different students to do, which I think is a much better form of differentiation.
Absolutely. And when you're saying about like not being lazy, I mean, I'm not saying anyone is lazy. I'm not saying that people are doing this because they're lazy. It's almost like a misguide. I know of very, very good teachers that have used a Bloom's crib sheet just to change the verbs in questions.
Absolutely.
And not actually give much. They're focused so much on this part of the work and not the content of the work. They're focused more on the verb because they kind of have to be kind of seen to be doing that almost.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's where differentiation I think should focus.
Yeah.
So I think really what we need to think is, if that's not how we use Bloom's, well, how perhaps should we use Bloom's? And I think what we should be doing is saying, well, the best way to use Bloom's, we think, is probably to go, we want all students really to be as cognitively challenged as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And what you want to do is go, okay, well, if we want to get all students to be moving up that cognitive level, is to say, well, how can we ask more cognitively challenging questions to as many students as we can?
Okay.
And that could involve, even some of your less able students being asked potentially quite cognitively challenging questions, which isn't always obvious to do. And to do that, it involves a little bit of extra planning initially until you get good at it. So a simple example I would give you would be, for example, I always think things like pictures are very good for this.
Okay.
So you would typically expect, in normal lessons, you might ask questions like, what did we do last lesson? How does that work? What does that do? Recall questions.
Yeah, recall, yeah.
Yeah. So, but if you wanted to change that question to be more cognitively challenging without necessarily being content difficult, you might put up a picture of something the student's never seen before. But it might not be something that's difficult to understand. And you say to them, what do you think that might do?
Okay.
Now, it might be reasonably obvious what that thing does. But by asking them, what do you think that might do? You've straight away moved to a much higher level of cognitive question, haven't you?
Yes.
And that student might be very able, even as a weaker student, to say, oh, right, well, I've had a little think about that. I think maybe that does that. And that's quite a high level Bloom's question.
It is.
Even though the thing might be reasonably obvious as to what it might do.
Yes.
But it's not a recall question. It's quite a high level Bloom's question. So you can ask potentially quite cognitively challenging questions to potentially all of your students, rather than trying to pigeonhole high level student, high level Bloom's question, weaker student, low level Bloom's question. And I think that's the best way to try and use these sorts of questions.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And if you want some more ideas on questioning, there are free places here you can visit to get some more ideas on some questions.